design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View. And first of all, Happy New Year. And I do want to take care of just a few minor details before we get to our interview today with Dr. Pamela Pyle. Our book is entitled Anticipating Heaven. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But a couple of questions that are probably on your mind. First of all, as we went off the air on December 31st, we talked about the fact that we had made the first match. We had met that match actually the day before, and there was a second match put on there. So I think we can confidently say, number one, we met the first match. Number two, we've met our goal. And of that second match, I think we're about 3/4 away from finishing that. Now, we recognize some of the mail might come in, which would help us reach that final goal. But again, we've left up for you on the website, pointofview.net, an opportunity for you, if you wanted in the year of 2025 to make a gift, that would still be matched until we run out. So again, I think many people oftentimes say, did you make your goal? Yes. Did you make your first match? Yes. We added a second one. We probably will finish that one off very soon. And so that's all good news. And I'll try to announce it a few times, because my wife yesterday was on one of the phone calls and somebody said, well, you don't take enough time to talk about whether or not you met the match. So I'll say it now. I'll say it again next hour so that you know about that. As you might imagine, we will continue with our interview today, but we also recognize that next hour we're going to spend some time talking about what happened in New Orleans and Las Vegas. So far, the FBI says that it believes that the suspect there in New Orleans, the New Year's Day attack, which has killed, I guess the estimates are now 15 people, that had nothing to do with the explosion of the Tesla Cybertruck outside of the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas. Well, color me skeptical. If for no other reason, these two men used the same car rental app. They both have served in the military in what at that time was called Fort Bragg, now called Fort Liberty. And as one commentator put it, when you detonate a truck made by the company of Elon Musk in front of a hotel with Donald Trump's name on it, I think the political message of the attack is awfully darn clear. And of course, you might be wondering, what about the barricades? Well, those barricades usually are up and would be up for the Super Bowl, but were actually taken down, and that made it a little easier, although I think he could have avoided some of that anyway. And of course, as many of you that are football fans may know, the Sugar Bowl has been postponed till today, about 2 hours from now. So just wanted to recognize that we will spend some time talking about that in some detail. Also have posted some other articles related to the congressional agenda for Congress, the whole debate right now of Tik-Tok and Donald Trump's involvement with that, and a few other issues. And if we don't get to everything today, don't forget tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. Benedexter, Kelly Shackelford will be with us, and we'll get into all of that in more detail. But let me bring to the microphone now Dr. Pamela, as many people refer to her, and she is a board-certified internal medicine physician. She's also the chairman of the board of Africa New Life Ministries in Rwanda. You might remember a while back we got talking about Rwanda with another one of our guests, and I suggested for you younger listeners, maybe you weren't familiar with what happened in Rwanda. I suggested maybe you watch the film Hotel Rwanda, but maybe we'll get some update from her as well. She speaks both nationally and internationally on topics related to such things as evangelism, women's discipleship, healthcare, and this particular book on end of care, anticipating heaven, spiritual comfort, and practical wisdom for life's final chapters. And Dr. Pamela, Thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. It is so great to be with you. But we are living in a sobering day of the events of yesterday, and I know that you have a lot of thoughts around that, as do I. But it's just a really time for mourning.
It is, and maybe
so
very appropriate
here.
for your book. As a matter of fact, just before I came on the air here, my wife was telling me about somebody who just died, and that's going to affect some people who will be coming on our Greece trip next May. So we live in a world where death and dying takes place. Back in 1980, I wrote a book with Zondervan, Life, Death, and Beyond. And so in some respects, going through your book, which is so much more detail, it reminds me sometimes, Dr. Pamela, that we have individuals that are in the medical profession, perhaps you've said it as well, when someone is near the end of life saying you need to get your affairs in order. And in some respects, this book, which is coming out next week, has 13 chapters to really help our listeners get their affairs in order, doesn't it?
It really does. And the best time to get our affairs in order is before the crisis occurs, before the call comes, before the diagnosis is made. And there are a lot of things that we can do, even when we're young and healthy, that will help diminish the chaos and fear that affects families every day, because the unexpected happens every day, just like we saw yesterday. And, you know, as many of the victims were very young, we don't even imagine that we're going to lose them. And so by being aware of this constant tension between the reality of the end of life and that we're not aware when it will come. And so there's, you know, a message in that is universal, is really about living our lives as if tomorrow might not come. And what does that look like? And I speak to that a little bit in the book, because many of the patients I described were just like you or I, living a normal life with all the ups and downs that normal life has. But then they get a diagnosis that is unexpected. And I really enter the book with the idea of reaching those that maybe it's just their first diagnosis. It's not a terminal diagnosis, but it still affects them, affects their family. And there are different things that we can do to plan ahead. But also, if you've ever been in the medical system or healthcare system for any reason, you understand that it can be complex. And a lot of times patients don't feel like they're being heard. And so that's one of the reasons I really wanted to give practical advice about, you know, these are the questions, these are when to ask them.
Very good.
These are your rights, and what to expect, you know, if you were to go to a hospital. All the things that we don't really want to think about, but the truth is, if we plan ahead and even really have a clear perspective on our own mortality, it changes how we live today.
Let's take a break. We will continue our conversation about this book coming out next week, Anticipating Heaven. We'll be back right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Everything you know about income inequality, poverty, and other measures of economic well-being in America is wrong. Former Senator Phil Gramm was on my program to make that case recently. He is the co-author of the book, The Myth of American Inequality, How Government Biases Policy Debate. I might mention that his co-authors hold to very different political views from him, but they do agree that we need to get the facts right before we can have a policy debate about economic issues. The myth of inequality really began back in the 1940s when the Census Bureau excluded all income that was not paid in the equivalent of cash. That simplification made sense back then, but made less sense when the 1965 War on Poverty expanded government benefits. Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and 100 other government benefits are not counted as income to the recipients. Another popular myth is income inequality is growing. When all transfer payments just mentioned are counted as income to the recipients and all taxes are counted as income lost to the taxpayer, income inequality is lower today than it was 70 years ago. As you might imagine, the bias we just mentioned also affects the official measure of well-being. For example, the government does not measure 88% of all transfer payments the poor receive when calculating the poverty rate. If those payments are included, then the poverty rate in 2017 would be 2.5%. For comparison, the official poverty rate that year was 12%. The authors also make specific recommendations for dealing with some of the reasons for income inequality. And if we're going to have a productive policy debate about these economic issues, we need to listen to these authors and get the facts right. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of Patriot Preachers, go to viewpoints.info/Patriot Preachers. Viewpoints.info/Patriot Preachers. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Our topic this first hour is this book, Anticipating Heaven. Then we're going to get back into some of the things that have been taking place over the last 48 hours. But again, if you'd like to know more about this book, first of all, it is coming out next week. We have an advanced copy here right now. If you'd like to know more about Pamela Pyle, Dr. Pamela Pyle, again, you can go to her website. It's drpamela.com. We also have a blog for Hope for Every Season, which is her blog, and also, of course, information about the book in case you would want to pre-order it, and there's a way in which you can get it in Kindle or paperback. And it is published by our friends at W Publishing, which is an imprint of Thomas Nelson. 13 chapters. We're going to focus some time, first of all, on this first 7 chapters, preparing your plan. But Dr. Pamela, I thought it was maybe appropriate that both in your book and then on your website, you talk about being with this woman who was at the end of life, and she said she was ready for a good death. That's a phrase that I have seen people use, but it probably is jarring for others. But that, in some respects, is why you put this book together, isn't it? Okay, we'll get her back on the air in just a minute, and as soon as we are able to do so, we'll take some time looking at some of those other issues. Let me just, as a program note, let me just mention while we're trying to get her back on the air that I did mention that we had lost an individual just recently, was going to come on our Greece trip, so I will be talking about that later on this hour, that we still have some openings. If you'd like to join us on our trip to Athens and to Thessaloniki and Philippi and Corinth and other places, be taking place in May of this year. Just a great opportunity for you to join with us. And again, as I mentioned just a minute ago, we'll spend some time in the next hour certainly trying to get into this issue of what happened in New Orleans. And I have been more recently writing about and thinking about the issue of homegrown terrorists. That is, We certainly have open borders, so there are certainly people that have come over the border that certainly represent a possible threat to us from a terrorist point of view. But I think it is also telling that there are some examples, and it seems to me that the examples we're talking about here, individual was involved in the killings there in New Orleans, or the one that blew himself up in Las Vegas, one from Texas, one from Colorado, illustrating, if nothing else, to me, the fact that that's something we're going to probably have to be dealing with on a pretty regular basis. So we'll see if we can connect back up with Dr. Pamela Pyle. But while we're doing that, let me just mention there are some other resources that we would certainly want to put in your hands, and we'll be talking about those today here on Point of View. One, of course, my Viewpoints commentary is called American Inequality, and it begins to help us understand that sometimes when we are told, I think sometimes very much told about this idea of the fact that there is a wage gap, while there is real truth to that, there is a sense that income inequality may not be growing like we've been thought that it was. And that gets back to the fact that we, a number of years ago, had the Census Bureau exclude any income that was not paid in an equivalent of cash. Now, back then, maybe it made some sense, but then by the time we come to what would the oftentimes referred to as the Great Society programs in the 1960s under President Lyndon Johnson, you had all sorts of benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and the rest. And so those are never counted as income. But if you were to count those as income, that gives you a very different picture. That's one of the reasons why I took the time to post this again, a piece. It was an interview that we did a while back with the former senator of Texas, Phil Gramm, along with some others. And so that's my commentary there for today. But I believe we now have Dr. Pamela back on the phone, and it is great to have you once again joining us.
Thank you. I'm not sure what happened, but, technology is a great thing. It's also a difficult thing sometimes.
We live and die by technology on this radio program, so I understand it only so well. But again, just when you were off, I talked about the 13 chapters. The first 7 are preparing your plan, but one of the first things we need to know is to actually put information together. You have a section on the power of knowledge. Know how your healthcare system works, know your hospitals, know your wishes, know your companions, know your schedule. Can you talk us through that? Because that seems to be one of the key elements in those first couple of chapters.
It truly is. And Sir Francis Bacon, his quote was, knowledge is power. And that is really applicable in the healthcare system because it can seem very foreign. And when you have knowledge, you are able to ask the questions that you need to know before you make decisions. And so often, and, I work on as a physician, so I see this. I try not to do this, but sometimes physicians are very rushed. And so by having your questions in advance, knowing which questions to ask, and also knowing that if you're not getting the answers that you need, how to find a second or sometimes a third opinion, because this is your health. You only have one physical body, and so you want to be able to make sure that you're making the right decisions. And so by gaining that knowledge, even the simple fact of if you were to call 911, which hospital would you be sent to? Is it one that you would want to be sent to? Do you have other alternatives? So there's a lot of information in those early chapters about equipping patients and their families with the knowledge to help them navigate our system and really any system because it's based on principles. Mm-hmm. And following the principles will be an endless, it won't be time sensitive. It will help you now, or it will help you in the future, or even caring for your parents if you're in that stage of life.
Might just mention, too, you have a section there called the stripping effect, or some people have called it the stripping process. And I think that would be comforting for some, because you're a doctor who works in hospitals, but you've been a patient as well, as I've heard you talk about. And it does seem to me that almost all of us that we've ever been in this situation or been that in a situation with a loved one, a doctor will ask some question about your bladder, and you're going, well, that's not my problem. I got cancer. They'll ask, or they want you to do this, or they want you to take that, and you're just like, I don't get it. And sometimes there is a tendency, because the healthcare system is a healthcare industrial complex, you're just sort of one cog in this huge machine. And sometimes it's kind of hard to figure out where you fit in all of that, isn't it?
It truly is. And the stripping effect is really something from 1975, but I see it more today. And it's really, it begins with handing over your this is more in a hospital setting, but handing your belongings. Sometimes, in fact, a lot of times, you're not allowed to bring a loved one in, so you're facing a circumstance alone. And then, if you are admitted to the hospital, you turn over your clothes, and a lot of times, your access to the outside. So it's a very difficult circumstance to go through unless you're prepared and kind of know what to expect, and then also know what to request in terms of your rights as a patient in a hospital.
Yeah. I need to take a break.
Knowledge is power.
I thought when we come back from the break, though, we might get into some of those, because you talk about the hard choices, and that's kind of one of those issues. And then I really want to get into some of the other things that you've written about as well, which get us into not only preparing your plan, but preparing your mind, heart, and soul. So certainly a large part of this book could be written by anyone, but because of your Christian convictions and your own experience over the years, you've got a whole section on that as well. So let me just mention real quickly that if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more. First of all, the book is coming out, and you probably could either pre-order it or be looking for it in your local bookstore. But I might also mention we have a link to drpamela.com, and that is an opportunity for you to journey with her as she offers compassionate guidance through faith-centered conversations on suffering, grief, and death. For those of you that would want to follow her on her blog, it's entitled, again, This Idea of Hope and Living with the End in Mind, and that's also linked there. And of course, we have information about the book, Anticipating Heaven, Spiritual Comfort and Practical Wisdom for Life's Final Chapters. It is published by our friends at Thomas Nelson. Take a break, and we'll come back with more right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again with Dr. Pamela. And again, if you would like to know a little bit more about her, you can go to our website, drpamela.com, and find out a little bit more about what is involved. There is, of course, a blog and, of course, this book, Anticipating Heaven, Spiritual Comfort and Practical Wisdom for Life's Final Chapters. It is written by her. It is published by W Publishing, which is an imprint of Thomas Nelson. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore next week, but we're giving you kind of an advanced look. And Dr. Pamela, the first thing is there is a section on the hard choices, and it talks about some of the wishes that individuals have, the so-called 5 wishes document. And that's important because these questions are not easy to answer. Having written a book on death, having a chapter in one of my books on ethics on euthanasia, every once in a while I get one of those phone calls, and it's from one of my former seminary students or somebody who has picked up the book, said, okay, we have some real tough decisions, and the doctor encouraged me to get some counsel, and they then lay out what I think are sometimes very difficult questions for us to try to work through. And yet, if we're not anticipating some of those, and whether it's through a living will or a durable power of attorney or something, you're going to get caught off guard, aren't you?
Yes, you absolutely will. And the thing about it is if we complete what is now called the gold standard or an advanced care plan, when we don't need it, it will help our families make decisions if we are in a state where we can't make them for ourselves. And the reality is, for Christians in particular, they have, as a demographic, often choose more aggressive care and maintaining life support to the detriment of the patient. And a lot of that is a misunderstanding of theology. Some of the things that I hear is, well, we're waiting on a miracle, and that's why we should keep them on machines. But for me, the truth is, I have seen some amazing miracles.
And it looks like we lost her again. So let me just mention to see if we can get her back on the air. But and I think what has happened is when somebody's calling her line, it knocks her off the air. But we'll see if we can get her back. But again, this is one of those places where there are oftentimes some really difficult questions. Because on the one hand, you can think of in 2 Corinthians 5, the Apostle Paul says to be absent from the body is present with the Lord. And so in some respects, we recognize that we don't necessarily have to do anything we can to extend life, because we recognize that death, as Jesus and certainly Paul and others have said, is great gain. So to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, 2 Corinthians 5:8. On the other hand, we also value the sanctity of human life, and we don't want to end life prematurely. So this is one of those very rare times, since I've written a book on Christian ethics, in which you really have two equally biblical principles. I don't think they're at war with each other, but sometimes it's difficult to sort them out. And so in some respects, that's why I thought this chapter about the hard choices would be helpful, because that's where it really is difficult. And as she pointed out just a minute ago, sometimes because we maybe come with this idea that we're supposed to save every life in every circumstance, we want to maybe go to extraordinary means to extend life, but sometimes what it does is just extend suffering. And so there's a sense in which we have to recognize there's a balance between, of course, 2 Corinthians 5 and, of course, Genesis 1 and 2 or Psalm 139 and other passages. So those those are some key issues. And I think we once again have Dr. Pamela back on the air. We'll see if we can keep working our way through this technology. But while you were gone, I just talked a little bit about kind of the idea of recognizing that we want to allow people to go on and be with the Lord, but at the same time, we have the idea of the sanctity of human life. And as you pointed out, I think sometimes Christians think that they have to do everything to extend life, and sometimes what they're trying to do in extending life is just extending suffering, and the patient is ready to go on and be with the Lord. Is that fair?
That is that's actually perfectly said. And in the moment, it's very difficult to know if you're making a decision to extend suffering or to extend life. And that's why planning ahead and really reflecting on what you would want in certain circumstances is very important. In the 5 Wishes document, which I used as an example of an advanced care plan, is very thorough. In fact, it was the first ACP written. It was written by an attorney that was very close with Mother Teresa. And so it has a lot of spiritual aspects as well as their wishes for medical care. And it's called The Plan with a Heart and a Soul.
Mm-hmm.
And at 5wishes.org, you can purchase it for $5, a printed copy, or a digital version for $15, which, we do a lot of things randomly with $5. But there will be no greater treasure or bargains than the 5 Wishes to do in advance.
Let me get into a few practical ones that are in your section on anticipating heaven in the storm. One is finding a good doctor. And then you also have one on a paradigm shift, choosing hospice care. But what about that? You're a doctor, and what would you recommend? Because part of that question, even if I have the document, even if we're all on the same page as a family, some of that has to do with choosing a doctor or even trying to consider hospice care. Can you help us with that?
Yes, so choosing the doctor is really more for the early aspect of a healthcare journey. A lot of times when it comes to someone who's reaching the end of life or the end of care from, let's say, an oncologist or a cardiologist, they will often call a palliative care medicine, physician, which is someone who takes care of those that are facing the end of life. But the truth is, if you were to look at the hospice industry as a whole, it probably has more of a business feel than any other aspect of medicine, which is very unlike it started, which was a Christian hospice in the UK in the late 60s. So doing your homework for hospice care in advance in your area is very important. And you really want a hospice that reflects your values, your spiritual and faith beliefs, and then also get to meet the people that would potentially be caring for you in advance. In the book, I have a pretty detailed section on how to identify those features, so faith and recommendations, but also you want care that is very effective and also well done. And so if you were to purchase a book, there are many resources for really the grades for each hospice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important because hospice care can be an extremely wonderful experience. But it also can turn out to be not a wonderful experience. As an example, I had a friend that was a hospice physician, and she was asked by the business owners, which it was non-medical owners. It was not a Medicare certified facility. She used medicines that were less expensive, still in the category of pain control, versus medicines that were more effective for that patient's care and was more expensive. And so that is, a hospice facility is paid a per diem, and they can spend all of it on the patient care, which is what they should, versus paying a small amount.
Let me just mention, too, you've got 15 questions to ask when choosing hospice care, so lots of very good practical material. We'll come back for a few more minutes talking about anticipating heaven right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk with Dr. Pamela. It is Dr. Pamela Pyle, and again, forward by John Maxwell, which I think you will appreciate his very insightful forward to the book as well, Anticipating Heaven, Spiritual Comfort, a Practical Wisdom for Life's Final Chapters. Really does help you kind of begin to know how to navigate through this kind of foreign world of healthcare to really prepare, maybe as we've been talking about, an end-of-life plan, but also just to maybe as we conclude, Dr. Pamela, talk about this issue of heaven, whether it's been Randy Alcorn who's been on this program or Lee Strobel or a variety of others who have written books about heaven. That is, of course, our heavenly destination as believers, and you've really devoted some time to that as well. You focus on, for example, the power of prayer in God's sovereign care, the issue of hope and suffering, which was very powerful, some of the preparation, and then finally a chapter on the good death, a good death. So talk about that, because it does seem to me that as a doctor, you're looking at the medical, physical issues, but as a Christian, you're also looking at the emotional, psychological, and spiritual issues as well, aren't you?
Yes, and I have to say the latter is the most important message that you'll find in this book, is regardless of our circumstances, our suffering, our pain, and even our dying, as believers in Jesus Christ, we have this amazing destiny that the only way to reach heaven is through the door of death. And so if we don't look at death as just an enemy, because we know that Jesus conquered death, we can see it as a friend that walks us into the arms of our loving Savior. And what I really had hoped through writing this book, and really the last half of the book has been my favorite, because we can treat someone with medicine, and we may even cure a patient with medicine. But that patient, as we all, will still die. And so the one true hope for healing is our faith. And the beauty that I have seen is in practicing medicine as a Christian doctor. I did 8 years without faith, and Jesus chased me down to the end of myself. And I have devoted myself to loving him and sharing his name. But as a Christian physician, there are so many beautiful things that can occur in the dying process, and especially at the very end. And that's it is hard to explain through written word or even what I'm telling you now, what it's like to be with someone as they are crossing over.
Mm-hmm.
And in these rare occasions, and I think Lee talks about it in his book, you will see someone experience heaven while they're still here. And I've seen that with a friend that was passing and had been unconscious until the very last moment. He sat up in bed and clapped his hands twice and said, "Jesus, Jesus," and lay back down and took his last breath.
And sometimes they'll say it's so beautiful or something like that. And just the veil between heaven and earth, I think, is getting thinner anyway. I'm wondering if some of these apparitions in the sky are something from the heavenly realm. But nevertheless, that is certainly an illustration of that as well. And just before I wind down, I want to mention that you not only have such practical material in the body of the 13 chapters, you have a number of resources at the end when decisions should be shared, guide to documents and advanced planning, understanding brain death, understanding persistent vegetative state, planning for peace checklist, the end-of-life timeline, signs and symptoms, even a dictionary of serious illness terms. First of all, I think any listener should get a copy of this because it would be very helpful, as you all at one time or another heard somebody say you need to get your affairs in order. But also as an individual that from time to time gets to speak in seminaries, I would say that if you are a pastor or you are an elder, you're a deacon, you're a Sunday school leader, I think you really need this book because you will be dealing with many of these issues, and the resources that Dr. Pamela, you've put into this book are excellent. So first of all, I know the book's not coming out till next week, so anybody can order it right now and get it delivered, or of course be looking for it in your local bookstore next week. But if nothing else, I want to thank you first of all for writing the book. Thank you for giving us an hour today and putting up with some of our technological glitches for one reason or another. But it has been a delight to have you on the program, so thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Kerby. And I do want to say, you're mentioning a pastor's. We do have ancillary Bible study and church resources. And if a pastor wants a book, they can email me, drpamela at drpamela.com, and I'll send it to them along with the email resources, the church resources, because it can be taught within the church, and then the church members teach others.
Sure.
This very important journey.
I might just mention, if you go to drpamela.com, right-hand point, hit resources, then scroll down. There's one that's called Church Resources, and that's where you can pre-order or claim your gifts that she was just talking about. So all of that is on our website, or of course you can just simply go to drpamela.com. Dr. Pamela, thank you for being with us, and it's been a delight, and thank you for writing the book and joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby, and thank you for what you do. You're changing the world. We need you.
Thank you. Just before we take a break, I did mention this just a minute ago, and that is that we do have our trip to Greece. We knew we were going to have one or two openings still here in January. We've now, as I mentioned just in passing, lost someone, and so we know that there are going to be another few openings for our trip to Greece, which will take place May 17th to the 27th. This is an opportunity to go to Thessaloniki, and to go to Philippi and Berea and Ephesus and Corinth and Athens, and it's just an incredible tour. Perhaps the last time we'll do something like this. And so if you found yourself hearing about this but had not made a decision about it, I'm bringing it up now because later this month we have to give back some of the seats that are actually reserved on the airplane. That doesn't mean you still couldn't go, but then we couldn't guarantee you the price. So if you're interested in this, probably the best thing to do would simply go to the website, pointofview.net, and you can either leave us an email, or of course, if you want to call the order line number, it's 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Of course, you could also use that to give your gift because, as we pointed out, we've just about finished off that second matching challenge, but there's still some room on that, and your gift would be actually counted in 2025, but it would still be matched dollar for dollar. So that's still a pretty good deal. And again, for those of you that are just joining us, we did make our goal. We did make that first match. We're trying to finish off the second one. If you would like to do so, there are ways to do so. You can click on the banner at pointofview.net. If you want to leave us an email or make a phone call, 800-347-5151. We come back. It's time to talk about homegrown terrorism here in America. We'll be back right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net, click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, and this was, of course, not the way to start out the new year. A rather bloody and terrifying existence, at least for those in New Orleans, and for a while wondering if this was just the beginning of other terrorist activities that might unfold. We now have a little bit more specificity to what has happened in New Orleans and Las Vegas, but let's see if we can kind of put this together. First of all, one of the articles I've posted here is by Gabriella Killett, who I think gives us a good quick summary of what has taken place in case you haven't been in the news cycle. And I know some people have said, I'm just hearing about this now. Well, again, that's because sometimes the news doesn't travel as easily. And I know some of you say, the only place I get my news is from Point of View. So let me tell you what we do know. And that is the individual who was able to, now I guess the number is up to 15 and more, and about 3 dozen individuals that have been injured, plowed a truck, a Ford pickup truck, through a crowd in Bourbon Street early Wednesday morning, about 3 a.m. in the morning there. We confirmed his name. I tend not to give it, but it is a name that sounds Muslim, and probably no surprise there. 42 years of age. The truck appeared to be rented. We now know that it was. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned in the last hour, it was rented, interesting enough, by using the same car rental app as the other individual that blew up the Tesla truck in front of the Trump facility there. Was it Trump International Hotel? Might give the right name there. And then a little bit later, after he was shot down by the police, there was a fire that broke out, which many people believe might have been limited to that as well, because of maybe an IED that finally went off. So that's kind of what we know so far, although I want to add to this as we go along, because the FBI has said today that it believes that the suspect in the New Orleans New Year's Day attack acted alone. Probably true, although there were for a while that wondered if there were other accomplices, and also said that there was no definitive link between that attack, which killed 15 people, and the individual that exploded the Tesla Cybertruck outside of the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas hours later. That being the case, you've already heard my skepticism, but let me repeat it once again, and that is you have 2 individuals on different sides of the country, if you will, that are actually using the very same car rental app. Both rented vehicles going to the heart of 2 of these great American cities with a goal to try to kill as many as possible. The driver of the Tesla Cybertruck is from Colorado. The individual that drove the Ford truck is from Texas. And in some respects, it's going to get me in just a minute into the topic which we've addressed before on this program, even done programs on this in terms of the idea of homegrown jihadists as well. But, of course, part of the difficulty has been that the FBI has been, until recently, more unwilling to call this a terrorist action. I'll get into that in just a minute. But for you to say that this was just simply an action, as Our friend Jim Garrity, who I quote from every once in a while, said, the car bomb in Las Vegas killed one person and injured at least 7 more. When you detonate a truck made by the company of Elon Musk in front of a hotel with Donald Trump's name on it, I think the political message of the attack is awfully darn clear. And the FBI was still trying to determine whether placing gas canisters, camp fuel canisters, and large firework mortars in a car associated with Musk in front of a building associated with Donald Trump meets the technical definition of terrorism. I think you probably know the answer to that question. Now, subsequently, let's give credit where credit is due, the FBI finally declared in a written statement, we are working with our partners to investigate this as an act of terrorism. That's good, because after all, that's what it looked like. The individual from Houston area is an individual whose life was unraveling. Messy divorce, increasing debts, failed business ventures, and the rest. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And so obviously an angry middle-aged man lashing out at the world, but also if you were to think that that was all, you also have to then go to a series of videos where he, as he was driving from Texas to Louisiana, discussed planning to kill his family, having dreams that helped inspire him to join ISIS. In other words, whether he was an actual member of ISIS or not, the ISIS influence was significant in his life. And as I've said before, you've got some individuals that say, well, he wasn't technically a member. And my favorite line on that has always been, I don't think ISIS gives out membership cards. So, just to say that he wasn't formally a member of ISIS is to miss the point. And then, of course, we've had this speech that was given by the sitting president, and I thought I'd make some comment about that because I'm sure we'll be getting into that tomorrow with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford, because Jeff Blahar has been on the program. We've talked with him before, and I actually posted, I think just recently, one of his articles, said, was anyone reassured by the speech by the president? Did it alleviate anyone's ease that the sitting president of the United States is half functional at this point? He says, I'm also going to ask why we as Americans have become so cavalier about the fact that tolerating a president who is permanently mentally incapacitated invites crises like these. He said 19 days, now it's down to 18 days, yet remain until Joe Biden formally departs from the presidency. Pray for peace and hold your breath until then. So this has surfaced a number of questions. First of all, what does the formal definition of terrorism really look like? Are we maybe in need of some cover for those individuals that want to, on the one hand, understand that these are terrorist actions, whether they meet the formal FBI definition of terrorism or not? And I've said before on this program, and we'll probably do a commentary, maybe even a booklet on the issue of terrorism, because we've referred to terrorism as the so-called new warfare. But it's different than your typical warfare. Even though we've produced a booklet on a biblical view on just war, terrorists really turned the notion of war on its head. And that is, innocent non-combatants become the target for terrorist activities, and terrorist warfare holds innocent people hostage and makes soldier and civilian alike potential targets. So we'll come back and talk about that for a few more minutes at least, and then I want to move on to some other issues because this is a topic we will revisit tomorrow. As a matter of fact, one of the articles we've posted by Noah Rothman really gets into, is it just impossible for the government, especially under this administration, to actually refer to something as a terrorist activity or a terrorist event? And apparently the answer is yes. And maybe that's another illustration for a while. Maybe it's going to be worthwhile to have a new president, a new FBI director, maybe a new attorney general. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Everything you know about income inequality, poverty, and other measures of economic well-being in America is wrong. Former Senator Phil Gramm was on my program to make that case recently. He is the co-author of the book, The Myth of American Inequality, How Government Biases Policy Debate. I might mention that his co-authors hold to very different political views from him, but they do agree that we need to get the facts right before we can have a policy debate about economic issues. The myth of inequality really began back in the 1940s when the Census Bureau excluded all income that was not paid in the equivalent of cash. That simplification made sense back then, but made less sense when the 1965 War on Poverty expanded government benefits. Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and 100 other government benefits are not counted as income to the recipients. Another popular myth is income inequality is growing. When all transfer payments just mentioned are counted as income to the recipients and all taxes are counted as income lost to the taxpayer, income inequality is lower today than it was 70 years ago. As you might imagine, the bias we just mentioned also affects the official measure of well-being. For example, the government does not measure 88% of all transfer payments the poor receive when calculating the poverty rate. If those payments are included, then the poverty rate in 2017 would be 2.5%. For comparison, the official poverty rate that year was 12%. The authors also make specific recommendations for dealing with some of the reasons for income inequality. And if we're going to have a productive policy debate about these economic issues, we need to listen to these authors and get the facts right. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of Patriot Preachers, go to viewpoints.info/Patriot Preachers. Viewpoints.info/Patriot Preachers. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
A couple more comments, and then we'll move on to some other topics because there is quite a bit to cover today, even before, of course, this attack in New Orleans and in Las Vegas. But I think it is appropriate to at least give you a preview of some of the things I suspect we'll be talking about tomorrow, because I have posted already an article for Friday that I'm sure Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter want to address. And that is the difficulty that we see at the FBI to define something as a terrorist act. Let's understand that even as we were learning more about this, the FBI in Houston was actually beginning to surround the trailer home of the individual who made the attack in New Orleans there in Houston. I'll talk a little bit more about how the FBI was actually second to arrive there. The media beat the FBI there. That tells you something as well. But at the same time, the police had obviously found the ISIS flag hanging on his vehicle, and also had heard many reports about how he had been radicalized. Of course, now we have the videos, including even one that I've been able to watch, and I'm sure you can watch it on YouTube as well, of a video he made years ago when he was actually working as for Deloitte, and he seemed just very rational. That's not the case now. But nevertheless, you had this post. FBI special agent says the New Orleans event is not a terrorist event. And somebody on YouTube and I think on X said, sure seems like an event. Somebody, please call Kash Patel. If you don't know who that is, he is the possible incoming director of the FBI. We'll see how that nomination goes as well. And so, again, you have a man inspired by ISIS, a terrorist organization, intentionally killing people in a crowd event with IEDs in his truck and having an ISIS flag, wouldn't that lead you to think maybe that's a terrorist attack? I don't know. What's so intriguing about this is I didn't know this until I started looking at some of these posts. The media made their way to his trailer home in Texas hours before the FBI showed up. And that's kind of intriguing as well. So we'll get into that as well. But again, here's a couple of things. FBI investigators have uncovered the writings by this individual, along with the ISIS flag found in his vehicle after the New Orleans attack, indicate that he was recently radicalized by ISIS to carry out terrorist attacks in the United States. Here's another post. A man who knew him says that he had converted to Islam, then began acting erratically in recent months. The concerning behavior led him having limited contact with his children. The terrorist, who killed, of course, now 15 people, was an American-born military veteran who was living in a rundown trailer park where he kept sheep and goats in the yard just blocks away from the local mosque. And so again, then you have, of course, these series of video recordings which he made while driving from Texas to Louisiana. In the videos, he says, for example, that he first planned to gather his family with the intention of killing them, then decided to join ISIS instead. And again, one neighbor said that he had remained isolated in his home, was not seen at his Muslim neighbor's local place of worship. And of course, the Army says he did serve 8 years, including deployment to Afghanistan, and on a now deleted X account posted information about real estate and the rest. And we had a job at Deloitte where he was paid six-figure income. And the one that still makes everybody kind of roll their eyes, the FBI were not the first people to show up at the suspect's address. They didn't show up until about 1 p.m. yesterday. Well, who beat him to them? Well, maybe the New York Post actually got to the house before the FBI. So sleep well, America. This is, again, maybe just more of an illustration of some of these topics. Just before we take a break, though, let me just one more time emphasize the fact that we will always see terrorism overseas for obvious reasons. That is, Islam is the reason for many of these terrorist actions. I've always tried to make the claim that not all Muslims are terrorists, but up until fairly recently, most terrorists have been Muslim. I do believe that's going to change when we start, as we talked about the other day with Colonel Allen West, a significant number of individuals who are here from China of sort of military age. Why are they here? Why did China let them go? And what do they have to plan? And of course, our March issue of Outlook goes into the issue of China in some detail. But we do have to recognize that there are a couple of reasons why we're starting to see more of an increase in homegrown jihadism, homegrown terrorism. One of those goes back to testimony given by previous FBI Director James Comey. You won't always see us quoting him favorably, but I think what he actually said when he was speaking to the National Association of Attorneys General was that ISIS had developed a chaotic spider web, and it was using social media to radicalize people in this country. And he referred to really a couple of problems. Problem number one, of course, open borders. Back when you were allowed to talk about open borders, these last 4 years, we've been assured that the border is secure. We know that that's not the case. The other concern that he raised was the fact that you had a number of individuals that had gone overseas to fight for ISIS, but since they're Americans, they were allowed to come back to this country. Because after all, they're American citizens, but they actually fought with ISIS. So those are what we call the returnees. But James Comey talked about the homegrown jihadists as being city wolves. And these are individuals that may have, in some cases, simply gone online and through social media were radicalized. Some of those potential ISIS converts actually went over to places like Syria, Sudan, Afghanistan, or the rest. And so ISIS has been using social media to do that. But just before we take a break, we did a very significant series of interviews, and this goes back a while, to the whole problem of homegrown jihadists, because what we were beginning to see then is that some of these individuals were not necessarily being radicalized on social media. They were being radicalized in the U.S. prison system. Matter of fact, in one of my articles, I quote from the late Chuck Colson, who, when he was alive, said, "I don't usually make predictions, but here's one I'll venture. If, God forbid, an attack of homegrown Islamic radicals occurs on American soil, many, if not most, of the perpetrators will be converted to Islam while in prison." And we've seen this happen in other countries. We see that it happened here in the United States as well. There was also a very good study that came out a number of years ago from George Washington University and the University of Virginia, which had the title Out of the Shadows, in which it was talking about some of the problems of homegrown terrorism. And, of course, you have to see that you've had attacks on mosques that have taken place from some of these jihadists. You've had some that have been involved in attacking military bases, some trying to set them off by remote control and the rest. And then we've even done some interviews about the fact that you've had in some particular places what looked like, from the outside, maybe terrorist camps. Now, fortunately, a lot of those have been closed down, but we at the time covered some of this through some interviews we did with the Christian Action Network. And the problem with this is that sometimes these would be areas which would be off kind of in the periphery. The local law enforcement didn't have, first of all, the jurisdiction to deal with some of that, but more importantly, even if they went in, they would have been outgunned and outmanned in those areas. And it illustrates again that this whole documentary, which you can still watch online, is called Homegrown Jihad: Terrorist Camps Around the U.S. It illustrates the fact that that is an area of focus that needs to take place from hopefully the new incoming Attorney General and the incoming Director of the FBI. Some of that has been allowed to go for too long, and part of it is always this idea that we don't want to make Muslims who are peace-loving feel uncomfortable. But on the other hand, we don't want to allow individuals who intend us harm to use our freedom or even sometimes our hesitancy to cover some of these issues. So it's a complex issue. It's one we will continue to cover here on Point of View. But if you want to watch that video on homegrown jihad, terrorist camps around the U.S., it's a little more dated now, and fortunately some of that has faded away. But it's just a reminder again that this phenomenon of homegrown jihadists is something to be with us for a while, something we'll be talking about, I suspect, for quite a number of months right here on Point of View. Let's take a break. We have more to cover right after this.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back for the final half hour, and if you would like to join us, certainly you can do so by going to the website, pointofview.net, finding 4 of the articles we're going to be talking about here. And if you, of course, want to leave a comment on Facebook or other places, you can do so. We would certainly love to hear from you. And I just, a while ago, but since people sometimes tune in and tune out, did mention that we made our goal. We met our first match, but we had a second match, which is still on the website. So if you are saying, well, I'd like to give in 2025 and have my gift match dollar for dollar, that's still available. So I did mention that is up there. And also earlier I did mention the fact that because of some things that have changed, we do have some openings on our trip to Greece. I'll hold this up. This is our brochure for those of you watching online, which we'd be glad to send to you. And you can give us a call at 800-347-5151 if you'd like to get a brochure about our trip to Greece in May, or if you'd like to make a donation in 2025, since we're now in the new year and have it matched, we still have a little bit left over there, which I think we certainly would be glad to give you a dollar for dollar match for that as well. Again, the trip to Greece, May 17th to the 27th. I'm really excited. Not only do we have a chance to go to all sorts of places like Athens and Corinth and Philippi and Thessaloniki and all the rest, then we get on a boat. We get to go to Ephesus. We get to go to Patmos, Crete, Santorini, and a number of other places. And if you'd like to know more about that, you can certainly give us a call, and we'll be glad to send that to you as well. 4 articles that are on the website. I was going to maybe do that for an entire hour. I'll see if I can squeeze this in to the half hour that we have. But the first one is about the congressional agenda. We are right up to the vote for the Speaker of the House, which will take place tomorrow. Perhaps by the time Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford are on, that will already be a done deal, but we don't know. And as this article by Audrey Fahlberg points out, the Republican leaders in the House will ring in a new year with a 219 to 215 majority, which is going to go a lot slimmer. One, you've already lost Matt Gaetz because he has withdrawn from consideration from the Justice Department, but has also resigned. But you have 2 other representatives, Mike Waltz from Florida, and Elise Stefanik from New York. And so that will bring the number to 217 to 215. So this is going to be very difficult for the current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. But we'll see where this is, because once you, until those seats are filled, have a 217 to 215 majority, it's going to be a real test for Speaker Mike Johnson, as they point out. But again, the first item on the agenda happens tomorrow, and that is who they vote for Speaker of the House. Then the real question is, what is next? Now, the big question is whether or not you will have enough votes, because you might say, well, you still have 217 or 219 votes from the Republicans, but you also have to go back in history a little bit and recognize that Mike Johnson was trying to push through a bipartisan bill. It was 1,500 pages. It had all sorts of things that were so controversial that Donald Trump and Vice President-elect J.D. Vance and billionaire Elon Musk all put their thumbs down, and so that didn't work. So then Mike Johnson came back with a second 116-page legislative attempt. That one went down because, if nothing else, it was going to suspend the nation's debt ceiling for 2 years. So finally, they ended up with a funding bill that was like that second one, but did not have the debt limit provision. Well, all of that has caused, for example, as we talked about on Tuesday, Representative Thomas Massey, Republican from Kentucky, saying, I'm not going to vote for the Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House. There could be some others, so we'll see where that goes. And so this is kind of a big issue. Who will be the Speaker of the House? And if it's not Mike Johnson, who are you going to pick? I can't even imagine who they'd come up with. So we'll see. And as this article points out, it is possible a handful of members could join Representative Thomas Massey, in opposing Johnson on the floor vote, if only on the first ballot, because what you also have at the time is the possibility that the Democrats could pull together enough to actually have a different individual, and so we'll see where that goes. So that's the first issue. That is, who's Speaker of the House. Second issue could be Monday, although I don't think that's going to be a big issue now, where simply you have the counting, if you will, the ratification of the votes that took place in the 50 state capitals for the Electoral College. And so this January 6th is going to be much less controversial, I suspect, than the previous January 6th, but that is the case. But then we come to one other issue. What happens first? There has been a desire to get one or two items dealt with simultaneously, and it is possible, as this article points out, that the congressional leaders in the House of Representatives might follow the plan that was put forward by the new Senate Republican leader, and that would be John Thune, in which you'd have one legislative package which would be focused on energy, defense, and immigration, and the second would be dealing with the 2017 tax cuts. Very significant kind of two-step route, and this would require, if you did this, actually budget reconciliation twice, which would be difficult because that's the only way you can circumvent the Senate's 60-vote filibuster rule, and it allows lawmakers at least to pass a legislation with a simple majority vote. But the question is, what comes first, the tax cuts or the vote on energy, defense, and immigration? And right now, you have in the House of Representatives the Ways and Means chairman, that would be Jason Smith, who believes that the tax-related legislation should come first. By the way, I happen to agree with that. But that would be one where you would deal with the provisions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, because that is set to expire on 2025 at the end of this year. And so the argument is, if we don't get this done first, it could linger forever and then cause some real problems. It would also send a very positive signal through the economy and to individuals in Wall Street, as well as in Main Street, that those tax cuts will be there, if not permanent, at least for many years, and that allows business to plan. As we've talked about, and even Kelly Shackelford brought it up, and I've brought it up as well the other day, one of the things business does not like is uncertainty, and we've had a great deal of uncertainty until now. That would add even more certainty about the economic future of this country and the tax scheme that would be affecting businesses. So as much as there's going to be a hue and cry and complain about it, I think that makes the most sense. But we'll get into that conversation perhaps tomorrow with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford. And for those of you that like TikTok, talking to my two daughters in that regard, there's a big question about that as well. It turns out that, of course, you've had a vote by Congress which says that if the United States finds itself in a situation in which the Chinese owner of TikTok, which would be ByteDance, does not disinvest from China, that after 270 days after the enactment of the law which bans TikTok, it would actually then cease to exist and would be banned in the country. Well, if you do the math, it turns out that that deadline happens to fall on January 19th. Which is one day before Donald Trump becomes president. And Donald Trump then has actually wanted the Supreme Court to hear, and will hear on January 10th, a case known as TikTok versus Garland, which is an attempt by Donald Trump to actually say, can't you just postpone it a few days? Because in some respects, I still think that TikTok is something that we can negotiate. If you read the amicus amicus brief, you have to smile a little bit because with his trademark puffery, it says, well, President Trump alone possesses the consummate deal-making expertise, the electoral mandate, and the political will to negotiate a resolution to save the platform. And also points out in that amicus brief that he has founded the resoundingly successful social media platform Truth Social, and he is one of the most powerful, prolific, and influencers of social media in history. Nobody's accused Donald Trump of being humble or shy, but nevertheless, the Supreme Court will hear this case on January 10th. They'll have to issue a decision pretty quickly because if nothing happens on January 19th, TikTok will be banned. If you'd like to know more about the inner workings of that, that is our second article on the website. You can read about it, and we'll probably talk about it again, but we need to take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention tomorrow will be our weekend edition. We'll get into some of these issues in a little more detail. But our third article is one that Douglas Carse put together, How Bidenomics Sank Kamala. I just called it Bidenomics in the Future because it helps us understand that some of the issues that the incoming president, Donald Trump and the incoming vice president, J.D. Vance, are going to have to deal with are sort of locked into place for a while. You can't turn the economy around instantaneously. You can't make inflation go away. You can't all of a sudden wave a wand and get rid of $36 trillion of national debt. But it reminds us of what actually tanked Bidenomics, that is Joe Biden, what it tanked Kamala Harris, and what could tank the Republicans if they don't pay attention. And this is about 10 pages, so if you really want to kind of geek out here or nerd out, you can do so. But it's just a documentation, finally, which illustrates that what you were feeling at the gas pump, what you were feeling at the grocery store, what you were feeling in terms of all sorts of expenses was not just your crazy imagination, as you were oftentimes told by some of the people in the administration. It was very real. First of all, there's an incredible chart here that talks about current financial situation, whether you're better off or less off, and he at the end gives us a commentary where he says more American families are worse off than they were a year ago by 19 percentage points. The difference is increased by University of Michigan methodological change, but it is still unprecedented outside of recessions. Normally, you have people dealing with that kind of economic pain during a recession, and here you can actually see the graphs. I'm a firm believer that not only is a picture worth 1,000 words, oftentimes a graph or a chart is worth 1,000 words. And so as a result, it shows that even for young adults, we're talking 18 to 35, they may be seeing their financial situation improving somewhat, but still their financial situation compared to a year ago is not as good. And it brings me to a commentary that I've quoted before, in which we point out that a variety of economists have said, look, the current generation is not doing as well as the previous generations of the same age. And I think, as I've illustrated before, you can't solve these economic problems if you don't acknowledge them in existence. And so it certainly was something where you had Janet Yellen, who was the Treasury Secretary, Joe Biden, who was maybe the caretaker president, not acknowledging the obvious. I think J.D. Vance understands that. I certainly believe that Donald Trump understands that. And J.D. Vance, because he's more in that age group, perhaps understands it more than anybody in the administration, and that's a good thing. Well, then this also then talks about some other issues, because the economic downturn and difficulty has really fallen on the backs of those who don't have a college degree. He says in the last year, the financial well-being of the high school educated versus the college degree holders has fallen to the lowest point in a half century or more. Economic distress is tragic for these families and for the nation. And so again, it's an illustration that it has not been as helpful to those who do not have a four-year college degree at a time when I think we need to encourage more young people not to pursue a four-year college degree, because there are very good jobs that are available, many more jobs available for those who don't necessarily have to go through 4 years, spend their time racking up debt and the rest. And so that is something that is going to have to be addressed in this next administration as well. Finally, when you look at the whole issue of labor participation, one of the most significant issues is, if you look at this chart, you can see that private sector jobs and public sector jobs have been kind of following pretty well. And then you have, of course, the Great Recession that comes about because of the pandemic. And then it never quite gets back to where it was supposed to be. So even though the jobs position looks good, it's not because private sector jobs have completely recovered. They have not. It's that there have been an additional number of public sector jobs. Put another way, the spending of Joe Biden has increased more people in government jobs, but that has not helped people in the private sector as well. And then when you look at the burst of prices caused by real incomes and all the rest, you can see that when people were saying, I feel a pain at the pump, I feel a pain at going to the grocery store. That was not in their heads. It was due in large part to the fact that that really was the case, because especially when you look at living standards, this is the final graph there, you can see a decline in living standards caused by inflation, which have been perhaps felt the hardest by people that are low-income Americans. And even the Brookings Institute, which is kind of a left-of-center think tank, if you will, said inflation systemically and systematically eroded the purchasing power of all families in recent decades. But it turns out the effects of rising prices have been more pronounced on poorer families, especially families of color. And so you can see that your experience was actually quite accurate, and these graphs and charts really illustrate that. So if you wanted to have that available for maybe a post on Facebook or X or TikTok while it's still around, it's there for you as well. One last one I thought I'd just mention real quickly, that John Stossel has done this interview with a advocate of the Second Amendment, and that's Maj Touré, who, by the way, is African-American and probably best known for an individual that has founded the organization Black Guns Matter, in which he points out that gun control in the past was racist, argues that it is still, if you look at the way in which there are individuals who are allowed to get a concealed carry license. Many more are given to white than to black. Very individuals that are in certain parts of affluent California compared to, say, Oakland, Compton, Los Angeles County. And he goes through that in some detail, and I think it's really quite illustrative. And so if you are, in some respects, wondering about this whole issue of gun control, especially as it relates to that, the latest study shows that about 1/4 of African Americans now own guns, which, again, if you watch the video or read this article, will, I think, be a great education for people that maybe aren't aware of some of our past history as it relates to gun control. Wish I had more time, but we simply tried to cover some of the important issues today, and that's certainly what took place in New Orleans and in Las Vegas. We will probably know some more tomorrow, and we'll bring that to the table with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford. But if you'd like to read any one of these 4 articles, you can simply go to the website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to know more about the book we talked about in the first hour, Anticipating Heaven by Dr. Pamela Pyle, that is available on the website as well. And one last time, since I did mention the trip to Greece, sadly, we've heard of couples that have had to cancel because of a death in the family. That definitely indicates the fact that if you've been thinking that this might be a trip you'd like to take, let me encourage you to call us and find out a little bit more. The trip is May 17th to the 27th. I'm very excited about it, and I think you would certainly love to, if you will, follow the journeys of Paul and John over through Greece and Turkey, and it's going to be a great trip, and I hope you can join us there. Again, you can give us a call, 800-347-5151. First of all, let me thank our engineer today, Doug. Thank you again for stepping in to help us out here. As always, we thank Megan for all the things she does, in this case, as the producer. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View's Weekend Edition. We'll see you then.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net. or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's a really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.